Okay, this video is about Carl Jung, psychology hero number 3. And what's going on is, as I'm reading through all this psychopharmacology and this other stuff about the brain, it's kind of like I keep coming across the history of psychology and psychiatry. So I'm just doing lectures on it now while I'm going through it again. You know, I like Carl Jung. I'd call him a guy who's sort of right in the middle. Carl Jung lived from 1875 to 1961. So he was part of that transition in the late 1800s, that de-Christianization in Europe. He was part of, connected to Freud. He also has things about himself that connect him to other things. For example, he reminded me of like Schopenhauer. He could read in multiple languages. He's kind of brilliant in some ways. He could read in Greek and Latin, English, French, and German. And he liked to read. He went back through tons of old mythology, which enabled him to see the overlap between Greek mythology, the Bible, and other cultures. And then the old joke was, it didn't seem like Jung was that smart. And then when one realized that he was able to talk his wife into letting him have like a cottage house office in his backyard along a lake and have a mistress there. Not many guys could talk their wife into that. So he must have some brilliance in that way. Jung studied cultures from all over the world, and that led him to seeing patterns that were common between all of them, and this led to his theories of the archetypes, the idea that there's certain behavioral patterns that are just part of the human life cycle. In the same way that an animal, a bird, migrates south in the spring, Jung said that a human has these innate releasing mechanisms, if you will, that when they are a certain age, they just do certain things, instinctual, like an animal. And I think there might be some truth to that. Like a woman, she's kind of got less upper body shoulders, so she doesn't need to gain so much weight, so she doesn't starve to death, and she still has enough weight on her to have a baby. But a young guy, she can only control a boy till about his puberty. Then the boy goes off with the men, and young guys have this instinct that they gotta get strong. They're so obsessed with lifting weights. These young guys, they always want to tell me how much they bench press, how much they squat or deadlift. I could care less. I wish them well. I usually end up telling them, get that cell phone out of your front pocket, stop microwaving your balls. But that's like pretty universal to young guys in my experience. They want to make big muscles and they're obsessed with lifting weights. Anyways, and then also the archetype, and I know there's some truth in that. There was a time when I felt I'm just ready to marry, a time when I just felt I'm ready to have kids, and it just seemed natural to do stuff to help out with having the kids. I didn't really plan any of it. It just sort of happened, and I didn't feel like I needed help. It just seemed natural to do all those things. So what are some quotes from Jung? Man possesses many things which he has never acquired but has inherited from his ancestors. He is not born as a tabula rasa. He is merely born unconscious. But he brings with him systems that are organized and ready to function in a specifically human way. And to these he owes these to millions of years of human development. And continuing with Carl Jung, whoever speaks in primordial images speaks with 1,000 voices. And that's that idea of, you just know there's categories of behavior that are normal for a single young guy, that are normal for a married guy, that are normal for an old guy. And people just tend to fit those patterns, and they vary them a bit, but we can kind of tell these things about it. And there are similar things for women, but I don't understand women as well as men. Jung continues, the more secular and materialistic our civilization becomes, the greater the unhappiness, senselessness, and aimlessness of our lives. So yeah, Carl Jung could kind of see a pretty wide range of history from, before electricity to the TV set and all these other things. Jung continues, science stops where logic stops. Imagination, feeling, and myth go way beyond that. And that's another big truism. Science is way overrated. People who really know a lot of science realize it's got tons of weaknesses. It doesn't tell you why something happens. Whereas myth, and like going to the work of Carl Pirsig and Robert Pirsig and Zen and the Art of Motorcycle Maintenance, there's a whole mankind thought process that's from way before all this science stuff, and that's deep inside of human nature. And if you want to understand people, that's real important. a lot more important. Like read something when you ever read a book about personality or about women, about male-female relationships written by a professor? They always stink. By definition, they stink. Anything that comes from a college professor stinks because it has to fit the college science mentality, which is almost by definition irrelevant. Anything useful about personality relationships, it comes from somebody who's got a lot of experience dealing with them in the real world and who doesn't care about college formality and college definition of science. And same thing, like some people say, oh, this paper is no good because it's not peer reviewed. Well, that's a lot of times wrong, because anything peer reviewed is going to be peer censored, and it's going to be limited to what that peer group normally considers appropriate for that field. So good ideas are going to come from outside the field. Okay, getting back to Carl Jung quotes, myth is more individualistic and expresses humans in a more accurate way than does science. Yep, I just anticipated that quote. Okay, Jung continues, warmth is the vital element for the growing plant and for the soul of the child. Loneliness does not come from having no one about you, but from being unable to communicate the things which seem important to oneself, or from holding certain views which others find inadmissible. Okay, that's good. And Jung is pretty good on that idea. He's real big on the idea of self-knowledge, self-awareness, and from self-awareness we can then become more aware of others and understand them better. And that's pretty common to a lot of philosophies, is the idea of from self-knowledge we then become more aware of everything else. And there's truth in that. And John Taylor Gatto, also a big proponent of that idea. Another quote of Carl Jung, a man grows with the greatness of his task. Okay, well, that's good. Basically, you need a big challenge in order to give you big motivation to make big efforts, and that's how you make big progress in developing your skills and your insights. Okay, Jung continues, the more a man's life is shaped by the collective norm, the greater is his individual immorality. Yeah, you see that all the time. Basically, when you put people into a system, the typical person is going to be very conformist, and the system is often going to want them to be cruel to one group of people or unfair to one group of people. And they will do it just because it's part of the system. I showed you, for example, look at the psychiatrist. They'll, put tons of people, and it's especially older women who get electroshock therapy the most. And they'll just, inject electricity and cause brain damage in a woman's brain. And then they'll just say, oh, well, it's my job. Well, why can't you have the ability as an individual with common sense say, randomly injecting an electrical current into a woman's brain is not going to help her. A TV repairman, as Peter Bregan, MD, had said, is not going to randomly just inject electrical currents all over a TV set. That's not going to make it better. Why would that improve something that's much more complicated than a TV set like a brain? And that's a typical example of a person being put in a system. Well, it's what the system wants me to do. Zap the brain. The poor old lady, now she's demented. They don't always become demented right away, but it does decrease their cognitive function, and they often give them multiple treatments. And a lot of the so-called experts recommend the highest possible doses, and they're causing a seizure. It's rather amazing that that's still going on these days. Okay, Jung continues, individualism is priceless. I always like hearing that, because the truth of the matter is modern world kind of hates individualism. And so I like hearing these smart old guys that say individualism deserves respect. Ayn Rand had the quote that the smallest minority is individual. And if you want to have interesting individuals, you got to respect and leave them alone and let them talk. Okay, give them their freedom of speech. Okay, Jung continues, from the beginning I had a sense of destiny, as though my life was assigned to me by fate and had to be fulfilled. This gave me an inner security. This gave me the strength to go my own way. Often I had the feeling that in all decisive matters, I was no longer among men, but was alone with God. Okay, now that's an important point, because there's a tendency in the modern world to mock this idea of a sense of destiny or a sense of a relationship with God or a sense of purpose. But you know what? The people who achieve the most, they typically have that. And a lot of times, too, somebody has that, a sense of they're on a mission from God, if you will, to become a great psychologist, psychiatrist for Carl Jung. It gives them the energy to continue, even though they'll have setbacks. When he had a falling out with Freud, his career went down for a while, but he bounced back. And that's another characteristic thing. People who have a sense of destiny, a sense of purpose, a sense of this is what they were meant to do, they bounce back better and often make great achievements, okay? Okay, Jung continues. The decisive question for man is he related to something infinite or not? Religion is a basic human need, according to Carl Jung. Okay, Carl Jung continues. Religious beliefs and practices are universally characteristic of human communities and are archetypally determined. The majority of my patients consisted not of believers, but of those who had lost their faith. The ones who had come to me were the lost sheep. Among all my patients over 35, all had a problem finding a religious outlook on life. Every one of them had fallen ill because he had lost what the living religions of every age have given to their followers, and none of them has really healed who did not regain his religious outlook. So what he was sort of getting at, in this contrast with Nietzsche, so, a genius like Nietzsche can create his own system of values, but for an average person, it's pretty difficult. And so having some structured tradition, either to live by or to rebel against, gives a person some structure to their life. If they don't have that, they can be very aimless and lost. Jung continues, the idea of the moral order and of God belonged to the ineradicable substrate of the human soul. He basically felt that was a natural thing for humans. The mass crushes out the insight and reflection that are still possible with the individual. Rational argument can be conducted with some prospect of success only so long as the emotionality of a given situation does not exceed a certain critical degree. If the effective temperature rises above this level, the possibility of reason having any effect ceases, and in its place is taken by slogans and chimerical wish fantasies. So yeah, that's an important point. Hopefully people can talk to each other and have a rational conversation. And my experience, a lot of times, if people don't agree at a pretty basic level, they just start arguing and insulting each other. And it's kind of sad, because to make progress and make things better, you got to be able to talk to each other. Another Jung quote, as with all dangers, we can guard against it only when we know what it is. Yeah, like look at food toxins. You have to know what foods have problems in order to avoid them. And most people don't, and that's why they're fat and sick and cognitively impaired. Okay, Carl Jung continues. As a child, I felt myself to be alone, and I am still, because I know things and must hint at things which others apparently know nothing of, and for the most part do not want to know. Now that's an interesting quote, because I read tons of biographies about all these geniuses and stuff, and it's very characteristic. They went through a prolonged phase of loneliness during their childhood or their adolescence, where they learned to spend a lot of time thinking and reading, and they had really rapid intellectual development at that time. And so that's good. Like I said too, if you're raising your own kid, you want the kid to be smarter, don't worry so much about them making friends. Social skills are pretty easy to learn. Don't get me wrong, it's great to have friends and social context. It's wonderful to have that. But that, you can see the cousins, or the special friend, one weekend. You don't need to be at their house all day, every day, because in my experience, the more kids socialize with their friends, the stupider they get. They get into like a whole clique mentality rather than thinking more like, parents want to guide the kids in a positive way. A good coach does the same thing. Sometimes a good mentor in whatever the field, a piano teacher or something. But around their friends, it's just cliquish stupidity of a bunch of kids all the same age. Okay, Carl Jung continues. Children are educated by what the grown-up is and not by his talk. That's a lot true. Like my father. Every day, the guy got up early in the morning and went to work. Every day, then after that, he'd come home, take the dog for a walk, he'd exercise, and he would read. So to me, that's what a man does. And then he'd argue with his brothers about books. That's what a man does. He had been an athlete. That's part of what a man does. All those things had a real good effect on me. Whenever I felt like I was wimping out on a class or something, I'm like, gosh, my old man, he doesn't wimp out. He gets up in the morning early every day, works his ass off. He doesn't stop studying. He's always learning. He doesn't have to take a test. He just wants to learn. And so that was good for me. Okay, Carl Jung spent much of his life trying to understand the unconscious mind. And he said, man's task is to become conscious of the contents that press upward from the unconscious mind. Intuition is a perception that an idea comes to us from the unconscious. And he had this idea, too, that we're connected to something called the collective unconsciousness, that all of our sort of ancestral history is to some extent buried deep within us. And if we can just listen to our own mind, we can sometimes recognize things, like getting a gut feeling, if you will, being your unconscious mind talking to you. Carl Jung says, the world will ask you who you are. And if you don't know, the world will tell you. And now that's very true. If you don't figure out a value system and what you should do with your life, you'll get forced into some lousy option and just have to work yourself off, work your tail off for not much personal or emotionally rewarding purpose. You got to make money to pay your bills, but it's nice to also feel like you're doing something useful and you're growing intellectually and emotionally and socially. Jung continues, descent into the depths always seems to precede the ascent. Yeah, and that kind of goes with Dabrowski and with Adler, that you have to take the setbacks in order to build to the future and not be whinier and drop out because of them. The achievement of personality means the best possible development of all there is in a particular single person. Personality is an act of the greatest courage in the face of life, and it means unconditional affirmation of all that constitutes the individual, the most successful adaptation to human existence, with the greatest possible freedom of personal decision. Few are chosen applies here as nowhere else, for the development of personality is at once a charm and a curse. Its first result is the conscious and unavoidable separation of the single person from the undifferentiated and unconscious herd. This means isolation. Neither family, nor society, nor position can save him from it. The development of personality is a favor that must be paid for dearly. Well, I think what I get out of that is if you want to be scholarly in any area, you got to spend a tremendous amount of time by yourself just reading and studying. And a reward comes from that, but it's mostly a personal reward. For the most part, other people could care less. When I first was a young guy, I used to try to talk to people about books, just regular people that I would meet on a daily basis. And they would not like it, and they would kind of think of me as a stuck-up jerk. Then I got interested in comedy because I noticed that everybody likes comedy, and I sort of would memorize all these comedy routines. Rodney Dangerfield, Sam Kinison, all these other comedians, tons of them. And I memorized the best jokes from all these joke books, and I know people always love it, so I'd always just tell jokes. And people liked me a lot more than they did when I tried to be my real self, who was interested in all these intellectual ideas. I'm lucky. I'm very grateful for the friends that I have that actually are interested in those things too, but I don't see them as often as I wish I did. Those who have achieved individuation of personality have thrust themselves up like the mountain peaks above their herd. They do not allow themselves to be seized by panic, for panic is already behind them. They are equal to the changing conditions brought about by time. Now that sounds a lot like the individualistic ideas of Nietzsche and self-development, but any of these old philosophers will say, it goes back to Plato and Plato's cave. Anybody who individually thinks by themselves also isolates themselves and does have awkward, lonely moments when they're not part of the usual social pattern. I think humans, our physiology is like herbivores eat plants, and our thought process tends towards being conformist like the rest of the herd. But if you're going to do anything interesting, you have to go your own way to a large extent on that, at least on that particular topic. Okay, Carl Jung continues. The wounded healer is one of the archetypes he describes. And that idea is if you've had a medical problem yourself, or a social problem too, but let's just say a medical problem, a health problem, and you really study out how to overcome the problem, you become really good at helping other people with the same problem. I got good at weight loss after I had been fat and had to learn how to lose the weight. I became good on the subject of coronary artery disease, not from training in vascular disease at Harvard, but from going through it with my father and regretting that I didn't figure it all out sooner. With my father's stroke, I learned a lot about strokes after that I hadn't learned in my regular training. Same thing with my mom's cancer. Unfortunately, Oscar Wilde had said, nature gives the test first and the instruction comes later. So you really wish you would have had that information first time around. That's another thing that pissed me off is why didn't I learn these things in med school and residency? Why did I have to learn this all on my own much later? And so I partly make that available if anybody really wants to learn, any person that really wants to help others with their health, look at the videos on my site. It's all there. I mean, I could care less. It's all free. Okay, now Carl Jung continues. The therapist must go on learning endlessly. It is his own hurt that gives the measure of his power to heal. When a patient first tells their story, they have a catharsis. In many cases in psychiatry, the patient who comes to us has a story that is not told, and which, as a rule, no one knows of. To my mind, the therapy only really begins after the investigation of that wholly personal story. It is the patient's secret, the rock against which he is shattered. If I know his secret story, I have a key to the treatment. In therapy, the problem is always the whole person, never the symptom alone. We must ask questions which challenge the whole personality. Okay, so that's great. What Jung is saying, you got to talk to the person. You got to give them time to talk, to explain where they're coming from. And I like this. It's kind of like Peter Bregan as well, Thomas Shaw's. You know, people are sad because they've got problems. They got emotional difficulties in their life, depressing problems, and you got to let them talk. And this is really much better, this component of psychotherapy and helping a person, than the biological psychiatry idea of just putting a label on a person. You're depressed, take a depression pill. You're anxious, take an anxious pill. You're schizophrenic, take a schizo pill. That doesn't get good results. But people could claim that's science, okay? Well, my experience of when people say that's science, what they usually mean is what's profitable for them. What actually really works in real life is this type of stuff. Why are you sad? What's wrong? What do you think caused this? What could be done to make things better? What do you really want to do? How could you maybe achieve your goals, or at least do the best possible given your situation? That kind of stuff really helps, and that it's thoughtful and kind and respectful. Like I said, the best advisors in my whole life for me was talking to my parents, especially my mom, because she loved me, she meant well, and she told me the truth. Jung continues, clinical diagnoses are important since they give the doctor a certain orientation, but they do not help the patient. The crucial thing is the patient's story. For the patient's story alone shows the human background and the human suffering, and only at that point can the doctor's therapy begin to take effect. We should not try to get rid of a neurosis, but rather experience what it means, what it has to teach, what its purpose is. We should even learn to be thankful for it. Otherwise, we pass by it and miss the opportunity of getting to know ourselves as we really are. We do not cure it. It cures us. A man is ill, but the illness is nature's attempt to heal him. Carl Jung. So basically, what you see when you read a lot of these guys, the best guys, they're all saying similar things. You know, this reminds me totally of Dabrowski's personality disintegration, reintegration theory. You take the pain of one problem and the energy from it and frustration, and you sublimate it into something else, and you end up better off. It's like Alfred Adler's inferiority principle. And these things are good because you can, if you recognize what is happening to yourself when you're sad about a frustration or a setback, you can much more quickly readjust and re-energize yourself to take on new challenges. But if you just feel like this victim, why am I so sad? I don't know what the hell happened to me. You're more weak. You're more vulnerable to additional problems. You're less able to cope. Okay, Jung continues. Sometimes the emotions a person feels are part of the subconscious mind trying to guide the person to a better approach to overcoming their problems. I am not pessimistic about neurosis. In many cases, we have to say, thank heaven he could make up his mind to be neurotic. Neurosis is really an attempt at self-cure. It is an attempt at the self-regulating psychic system to restore the balance, in no way different from the function of dreams, only rather more forceful and drastic. Jung believed that the decline in the practice of Christianity had led many persons in the 1800s, 1900s to a spiritual problem. He believed that Protestantism was relatively barren in comparison with Catholicism. If you look at the pictures of it inside a church, a Catholic church is so much more beautiful than a Protestant church. It's not even funny. There's no comparison. The Catholic Church will have art and statues, sort of more Baroque. It's full of life. On the other hand, a lot of times, Protestant preachers are better. They're married guys. They're often more individualistic. So, you could take a Protestant preacher and put him inside a Catholic church building or a Catholic cathedral. That would be really good. There's Protestant cathedrals a little bit, like St. Paul's in England, but in general, their churches kind of stink on the inside especially. Jung did not like the way the big cities made people into boring conformists who were vulnerable to manipulation, kind of like Nietzsche's herd mentality concept. Individuation is Jung's way of saying self-understanding and self-development. By self-understanding, we improve our understanding of the world. The relationship between Freud and Jung broke because Jung was pro-religious. That's one anonymous quote. Might be a lot of truth in that. Carl Jung continues, the purpose of human existence is to kindle a light in the darkness of mere being. Carl Jung continues, the individual who is not anchored in God can offer no resistance on his own to the physical and moral blandishments of the world. For this he needs evidence of another transcendent experience, which alone can protect him from the otherwise inevitable submersion in the mass. Merely intellectual or even moral insight into the stultification and moral irresponsibility of the mass man is a negative recognition only and amounts to not much more than a wavering on the road to subsumation of the individual. It lacks the driving force of religious conviction, since it is merely rational. Anyone who thinks differently is a heretic, who, as we know from history, is threatened with all manner of unpleasant things. Okay, that was actually like a couple quotes tied together, but what does one get out of that? What one gets out of that is one has to have a strong emotional feeling about what is right and wrong and how they're going to try to pursue what is good. And this quote is very much like Soren Kierkegaard, the Danish Socrates, and how he struggled to find what was his purpose in life and how could he live the best possible life. Where should he put his energy? Where should he focus his thoughts? And a smart person feels that. They feel a crisis of where do their values belong? Where does their energy go? What should they do with their life? And Kierkegaard talked about this a lot. And you have to go through that process of deciding what your values are. Otherwise, your values are imposed on you externally, and you kind of become just a conformist average person. If you want to be really good at anything, if you want to really get the most out of your life, you have to take that question very seriously. What's most important to me? Your family, your career. What are you trying to achieve with it? How can you do the best possible thing? Okay, Jung continues. No matter what the world thinks about religious experience, the one who has it possesses a great treasure, a thing that has become for him a source of life, meaning, and beauty, that has given a new splendor to the world and to mankind. Where is the criterion for which you could say that such a life is not legitimate, that such an experience is not valid? Religious experience is absolute. It cannot be disputed. You can only say that you have never had such an experience, whereupon your opponent will reply, sorry, I have, and there the discussion will end. Carl Jung. So that's it. Hope it was helpful.